In this next video, I just want to spend a bit of time looking at the interface for Flash or Animate. So like I said, my version is Animate because I subscribe to the Adobe suite, and therefore I have like the latest one. However, Flash itself, even if you're 2 or 3 iterations older, will probably look very similar to this in terms of its layout, in terms of the tools that are available to you. Now, you may find that if you have used it previously, then some of the stuff may be in slightly different positions, but actually the vast majority of the actual items will be there somewhere, and it's just a case of laying it out how you want it. One of the good things about all the Adobe suite is that you're able to dock certain panels that you might use frequently. So for example, over here I have panels for properties, library, actions, and so on. Now, I like to have quite a big view for actually editing my canvas, which you'll see in a couple of minutes time. So I try to have as big a area possible in this type of area. You may decide otherwise, that's entirely up to you. Now, obviously, when you kind of open this up, it is a little bit intimidating, especially if you've not kind of seen any of this stuff before. It's like, what on earth does any of this actually mean? Well, until you get really kind of quite au fait with Animate or Flash, actually, you're not going to use all of this stuff. It will take you a while to actually kind of fully get your head around. And that's only natural, it's only natural that you need a bit of time to build up these skills. Now, a really kind of good thing for you to kind of have a look at the beginning are these 2 areas here, where you have some tutorials set out by Adobe. So it's getting started, new features, developers, designers, and then you have the area to actually learn some of the items within Flash. So you've got Flash Developer Center, you've got ActionScript. ActionScript is the coding behind a lot of the Flash products. So people think of Flash as primarily an animation bit of software, but it is more than that. And you can make some quite powerful programs, and I said some whole games have been made using Flash, especially games for mobile devices have been made using Flash, and you can't do that without some kind of scripting behind it. So you would need to kind of get your head around the use of ActionScript at some point. Now, if you've done any web development before, ActionScript is very similar to JavaScript in terms of the way it's laid out and its structure. So that could be a beneficial thing to bear in mind. However, if you've not done any of that stuff up to this point, then it's going to be a little bit of a learning curve. But we've all had to do it at some point. And one of the nice things about the Adobe suite is that it will give you a lot of help in terms of how you do this. And for our project that we're going to do, we won't need to do anything too major. But I remember when I started out using this, and I was creating this website where you were able to put products into a shopping cart and then potentially buy the product. That actually required quite a lot of coding behind it, as I'm sure you can imagine, because you're dealing with quite a lot of data. However, in our project, we won't need to do that. Now, there's a number of different things down here where it says create new, and a lot of this stuff is more advanced than what you're going to need at this point. So, for example, the top 2 here, HTML5 canvas. So, one of the newer things with HTML5, which is the newest protocol or set of rules for HTML, which is the language that websites are written in. And it does allow the use of something called a canvas within it, and it's designed to link into Animate in this manner. We're not going to use that. However, there's something to bear in mind in the future. So therefore, you'll be able to embed this stuff into your website if you so wish in the future by using the HTML5 canvas. The WebGL is basically a JavaScript API application programming interface. I'm not going to go too far into that. because ultimately, unless you are going into IT, then APIs are really not the type of thing that you need to be necessarily worried too much about. Air is a runtime event. Now you may need to potentially have a little look at that. So in other words, it lets you run things on certain devices. So for example, you've got Air for desktop, Air for Android, Air for iOS. So you could design different devices for these different items. Now the one that I'm particularly concerned with right now is ActionScript 3.0. So ActionScript 3.0 is actually quite an old programming language. It came out when I was still at university, actually, so it's a long time ago. And like I said, it is very similar to JavaScript in how it's going to work. Now, the reason why we would choose this is because we're specifying at this point that we're going to use this programming language behind the scenes within our document. A lot of the stuff that you could or that we would use, you could potentially do in the HTML5 stuff. However, we want to use programming language behind it. We're not going to do too much, but we do need to specify the type of programming language that we're going to use. So I'm just going to click on that, and you'll see it's going to generate this canvas to begin with. So on all the Adobe pieces of software, you get this white screen. This is the canvas. Now, I'm not actually going to do anything in this video. However, what I will do is just describe some of the items within here. So you've got all of these different items on the left-hand side of the screen here, and there are more available than shown there. And some of them will look quite similar to what you will have used if you were using Photoshop or Illustrator, whatever it might be. You have to bear in mind that actually, although you can draw stuff in Animate, that is not its primary purpose. If you want to design stuff, you would use something like a Photoshop or an Illustrator and then bring it into Animate afterwards, because ultimately those are the programs that are designed to create images. This is more of a animation software, more of a almost like a programming piece of software. It's like a fusion of everything put together that you can use to create some quite funky stuff. So while you can create items, I would probably not. It depends on what you want to do. If you want to do a little button, you can do it in Animate quite easily, but that's up to you. Now, if you are used to using things like Photoshop, you can see that down here there is a timeline. Now, the timeline obviously isn't in Photoshop, however, things like layers are. So if you think of layers as, let's say for example you're using a flip book, and you're flicking through all of the pictures within your flipbook, you could potentially have a layer for every picture on your flipbook down here. Or let's say, for example, you might have different parts of your image on different layers, which means that you can edit one individually, which is quite handy. Each one of these items along here are frames, so you can have infinite number of frames. In this instance, mine is defaulted to showing 7 seconds worth of frames across all of this, but I can go out here as long as I wanted to, if I so pleased, if I needed. But you don't actually even need to think of it as number of seconds used, because actually when we come to do our quiz, we won't be doing an animation per se. Well, I say you won't, but you could put it in there if you wanted to, and that's your call. But I won't be doing that. So actually, I won't be using frames in terms of seconds. I'll be using them more as ways that I can help myself design this thing, and hopefully you'll kind of see more when I come to actually make it. Library over here is quite an important thing to do, and there's nothing in my library. I've not made anything in this library yet, but it is something to bear in mind. So basically, when you create stuff in Flash, you will probably want to start turning it into something called symbols, and those symbols you can define as images, as buttons, as videos, whatever they might be. And the reason you'll do that is you can potentially use multiple instances of those. So for example, if you have an image of a smiley face, you could turn it into a symbol, and then you can use multiple instances of that smiley face within the same document, which obviously is going to save you space. It's going to make it a lot easier for you potentially. If you have a button, you probably would want to use a button more than once within your program. Depends on what you're doing, really. So it is something to get your head around. I've said a lot there, but anyway. In things like properties, you'll see other items here, such as your width and your height. You can change those if you want. You just click in them and then type in the value. Your frames per second up here will be the number of frames that are shown per second. A number of you will be familiar with that term from gameplay. What we're going to do, it won't really matter too much. It'll just be a setting of what you're comfortable with. However, you probably won't want to have it too high, because otherwise it's going to be quite difficult for you to control more than anything. You've got a stage down here, so the stage is your I call it a canvas. I'm a bit old school in that respect. And you can draw whatever you want on there, and that's where we're going to have everything happening. However, you do need to also bear in mind that potentially you could have stuff off the stage and then it might fly in at any given moment, which is quite a cool effect. Okay, so we've had quite a lot of look at the layout here. There's also a lot things that you can bear in mind up here. So, for example, actions is something that we're going to be using quite a lot. Actions is where the coding is going to be. You could potentially have your history panel, which is a list of the history of the actions that you've made. So with your Control Z, undo, in other words, doesn't go back far enough, you could use history to go further back. Again, that's entirely up to you and something you'll need to get used to. Different workspaces here, so I've set mine to small screen. However, you may have any one of these selected, and in that case your screen is going to look slightly different, or in some cases quite radically different to mine, but everything should be on there somewhere. Okay, so I've waffled on quite a bit about the actual way it looks, but the most important thing is what you do with it. So let's have a go at trying something in the next video.